Oregon could be done in the portal, but they might not be done in the portal.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. This episode brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. So, plenty to get to today, lots of roster talk, and Dana's team won again because they just keep winning no matter how it looks. They just win. They just win. I can appreciate that. So, I'm thinking about Oregon's roster going into 2025, and they've added 8 transfers so far. 3 of those have come on the defensive side. You've got Bear Alexander, the defensive lineman from USC, Theron Johnson, the DB from Northwestern, and Dylan Thineman, the safety from Purdue. Is that all Oregon is going to add? Perhaps. The Bryce Betcher return on defense, I think, makes it less likely, but not impossible. I tend to think Oregon is done in the portal. I just never put a 100% confidence interval on that, and I definitely don't with the situation they have right now. So, the most likely position group where I think Oregon would add a transfer is safety. This is not a position where they're short on talented recruits, but if Oregon's going to push for another Big Ten championship playoff spot, try to contend for a national championship again, they're not going to want to have a guy who is almost ready. They want a guy in there who is fully ready. So the 2 names at safety that I think are most likely to be starting on the other side of wherever Dylan Thineman plays, you've got Kingston Lopa, who's in the mix. I mean, we saw him in the Big Ten championship game as a true freshman, kind of in that specialty role. I'd have to think he's at least in the mix. Peyton Woodyard is another safety. That was a 4-star who went to Alabama, enrolled, but then transferred because, like JKS did with Oregon in the quarterback room. Like, that's what he did last year to come to Oregon. He was on the 2 deep, but wasn't obviously playing consistently because Tysheem Johnson, Kobe Savage, neither one of them got injured coming down the stretch. But he's certainly in the mix. And then Aaron Flowers is another guy who's going into his second season in 2025. And that's kind of the room. You've got plenty of talent. You've got plenty of potential. You've got interesting players. I mean, Kingston Lopa physically is just really intriguing because he's 6'4", 6'5". And I thought when he got on the field and went against Tyler Warren, who's the best tight end in the country, I thought he did quite well. He made the one mistake. There was a pass interference that didn't have to happen on a 3rd down. Other than that, I thought he did a really good job. But was he just ready for that specialty role, or is he ready to be an every down player? Aaron Flowers didn't see the field in a meaningful way. Is he ready? Peyton Woodyard got some run as, a garbage time player for Oregon defensively. Is he ready to start? Just because a guy comes in, because this is where the conversation always shifts when you talk about the idea of adding a transfer is, well, why do you recruit these kids? Well, what about the high school players? What about guys on the depth chart? I want to see them. I want to see this. And I understand that because I do too. I mean, I come on here and talk about him and I think about, man, this guy could be that player. I watch his film and go, boy, he kind of reminds me of this Oregon Gray. He could become this type of player. But being talented does not mean you're going to be ready quickly. For some guys, it takes a little bit longer. And asking someone to play as a true freshman, like Trey McNutt is another name that I should put into this conversation. I saw a video of him going around on Twitter, and I mean, he looks huge. He's like 6 feet and just built. Looks physically ready to go. Does that mean he's immediately ready to play? I don't know. These are the sorts of things that might have to be sorted out in spring football. I think what you could see here is you've got all of these options, Lopa and McNutt and Woodyard and Flowers, and the coaching staff looks at them and says, okay, we feel like we've got enough talent and maybe enough experience to coach a guy to be ready to play one of the 2 starting safety spots come 2025. Then they might go through spring practice and decide, no, these guys need another year. They could be rotational guys, but they're not ready to be full-fledged starters. Because remember, with what Oregon is trying to accomplish year in and year out, And what some people, not myself necessarily, but I understand where people come from with this perspective. If the only goal that satisfies Oregon at the end of the year is winning a national championship, that's how you have to assess every position. Oregon safeties this year were not good enough. So you'd have to look at those guys and say they're better, or they're going to be better than what Oregon put on the field a season ago. And that's a tough calculation to make because they are incredibly talented. They have the physical gifts, but physical traits don't automatically translate. They don't even quickly translate. Think about a guy at another position that I'll talk about in just a sec, Devin Jackson, who's playing linebacker. He's going to have probably his best season as a Duck in 2025, or at least his most productive one because he will be asked to do the most. This is going to be his 4th year of college football. He could have another one in 2026. But his most productive season, year 4. And you've got all of these guys at a position where communication and understanding routes and coverages and all that sort of stuff is so vitally important. They're going into year 2 at the most. Lopa, year 2. Woodyard, year 2. Flowers, year 2. McNutt, year 1. So maybe one of those guys is ready. That would be great. But am I going to be surprised if Oregon adds a transfer at safety and decides not a couple of these guys need another year? Yeah, you could lose 1 or 2 of those guys to the portal as a result. But if it makes Oregon better in the short term and makes one of those guys better in the long run because they have the opportunity to develop, which, contrary to what some people might believe, Oregon does in fact do pretty darn well as a coaching staff, then overall the Ducks would be better off. So safety is one position I look at and say, you could add a transfer. Linebacker is another. It's the same question, just with 2 guys instead of 1. You know, I'd figure that Theron Johnson's probably Oregon's starting nickel or outside corner. I mean, I think he can play a little bit of both. He's got a similar, I think, kind of look about him, you know, with the way he moves and the way he plays as Brandon Johnson, who, of course, came in from Duke this past year and I thought was good in the nickel position. They're both about 5'10", 5'11". But at linebacker, you've got Bryce Betcher returning, which makes it less likely, but not impossible, for Oregon to bring in a transfer in that room. You've got Devin Jackson. That's a proven commodity. But Oregon's playing 4 linebackers, so you need 2 guys to be able to contribute right here, right now, for a program that expects year in and year out to push for a playoff spot in a conference championship. I know the talent that a guy like Kamar Mathuti or Jerry Mixon, or maybe the incoming true freshman Gavin Nix has, or there are a whole host of options there. Braden Platt, there are a lot of guys. Who's ready? Are they ready? And this again could be a position that Oregon staff looks at and says, let's see where we're at in spring football, but also maybe have some names in the back of our mind once the portal comes open, or having a plan of action if we feel, no, these guys aren't quite ready yet. So that's the calculation that I think the Oregon staff makes. But those are really the only position groups where I see a transfer making any sense. They've already brought in Malik Benson at wide receiver, and Evan Stewart's coming back. I think that's enough veteran experience to then work in the young guys, you know, the Jurion Dickies, Kyler Caspers, and I don't even know if you consider those 2 young guys. I mean, Kyler is going into his 4th year as a Duck, and Jurion's going into his 3rd. So they're not incredibly experienced, but they're not inexperienced either, per se, compared to other guys like Jeremiah McLaughlin or DeCorian Moore coming in. I think they're pretty darn set. And with Jamari Johnson coming over from Louisville at tight end, again, I think they're pretty darn set. But linebacker and safety, those are the 2 spots where if Oregon were to be active in the transfer portal, and last week I did a segment talking about the potential of adding Emmanuel Pregnon from USC, interior offensive lineman, that could be another spot. But defensively, I think those are the 2 position groups where you could still see Oregon trying to figure out if there's an option that makes them better than what they currently have on the roster. Let me know your thoughts in the YouTube comments below, or hit me up on Twitter at @SMcLaughlinCFB. So, is this roster going to be better in 2025? I think that is an incredibly daunting challenge to undertake. Of course, they're trying for that. I don't know that they can get there. One of you, though, disagrees. But I hope we all agree this episode's brought to you by TurboTax. We do all agree because it is. That's just a statement of fact. That's not something you can opine on. Taxes was dealing with piles of paperwork and frustrating forms and then waiting and wondering and worrying if you're going to get any money back. Now taxes is easily uploading your forms to a TurboTax expert who's matched to your unique tax situation, an expert who's backed by the latest technology, which cross-checks millions of data points for 100% accuracy. While they work on your taxes, you get real-time updates on their progress, and you get the most money back guaranteed. And while you go about your day, no stressing, no worrying, no waiting. This is taxes with Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service, real-time updates only in iOS mobile apps. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. My everydayers are not wondering why I just took a sip of water. You understand the importance of a good second segment sip. My everydayers on YouTube might be wondering, who is that? It's Ken Griffey Jr. He's up on the wall now. So, yeah, I just thought it was cool. Shout out to my buddy Alex who got me that for Christmas. So, can Oregon have a better roster in 2025? I think that's pretty tough to do. Now, that doesn't mean that it's impossible per se, but we can't know, obviously, until the season plays out and you get to have a whole assessment, because right now, Oregon's 2025 roster is, number one, hypothetical, and number two, on paper. Now, it sounds like I said the same thing twice. What the roster is going to look like is hypothetical, because we don't really know until you see spring football, really play out, and frankly, fall camp as well. But then even if you're right about what it looks like on paper, that's all it is. It's the roster on paper. So, like going into last year, I thought, hey, this is the best defensive line Oregon's had since 2014. It was. I think it was even better than that particular unit. So Dylan sent in this question, and I don't know that I agree with him. I'd love to be wrong, but he says, I'm sorry, but one more mailbag. He'd send in some other questions. And by the way, never apologize for sending in mailbag questions. This is my favorite part of the show. I can think of plenty of stuff to talk about. I'd way rather hear from you guys. So drop your thoughts in the comments below or hit me up on Twitter or become a Locked On Ducks insider. Is there any position next year that won't be better than this previous year? I think the only spot is tackle, and the only maybe is QB. More is up in the air as he has a much higher ceiling but lower floor. Other places where we lose a lot of guys are replaced by better guys, such as safety and or development of sophomore guys behind them, such as D-line and linebacker. Well, I have a hard time getting behind the idea that Oregon's defensive line is going to be better in 2025 than it was in 2024. That doesn't mean you can't have a similar level of production and it be really good. But you're losing. We have not heard yet on Jamari Caldwell, who I would love to have come back to the Ducks, but that's still being sorted out. If Caldwell comes back, that'd be a significant piece. I think Oregon has enough depth if he isn't there, because Amari Washington, I am bullish on Amari Washington. That guy is so good. But like in the long run of his career, I think he could be even better than Caldwell, and Caldwell was a stud for Oregon's D-line this year. But let's say Jamari Caldwell can't come back. If you lose him and Derek Harmon, who's going to be a first-round pick, and Jordan Birch, I know Oregon has recruited this position group really, really well. I know they have some key returners like Mateo Uiagalelei, and you've got Bear Alexander coming in from USC. It is darn near impossible, even for the best programs in the country that recruit at the highest level, bring in the best portal classes, whatever. It's darn near impossible to say you're going to look at that group and lose that much talent and be better next year. That is a really dicey proposition. So that's one group off the top of my head that I would love to see maintain the production they had this year. I don't know that they can. Doesn't mean they won't be good. Doesn't mean they won't be an above average unit that is productive. But when they face an offensive line like the one against Washington that just isn't capable, Is next year's unit able to put up 10 sacks? They might be able to put up 7 against a group like that. I don't know about 10. I don't care which conference opponent you're going up against. 10 sacks is an insane number. That is an insane number. And it wasn't just one or two guys. It was everyone. Harmon had one. Birch had a couple. Mateo had one or two. Like, everybody was getting in on the action there. Everybody gets a piece. Like Lloyd McClendon chewing out the umpires against the Yankees, and I think it was 2013, 14, sitting in that sort of time. Any Mariners fans out there will understand that reference. But it was an iconic call from Dave Sims. That's why it popped in my head. Everybody gets a piece. So that's one group that immediately I say it's hard to just replicate that production. Then I go to the offensive line and say, again, this should be a good unit for Oregon. I don't know that you can expect Isaiah World and Alex Harkey, the 2 offensive tackle transfers, to just come in and be as good as Connerly and Cornelius were this year. Connerly might have just played his way over the last month of the season in particular into being a first-round pick. And Cornelius, I haven't done a deep dive on his draft grade. I don't think he's going past the 3rd or 4th round. Can those guys do that? Maybe. But remember, Connerly and Cornelius were Oregon's bookend tackles in 2023 as well. They blocked for Bo Nix, and then they blocked for Dylan Gabriel. And that continuity up front, having a second year, like that helps those guys up front a great deal. It helps anybody in the position to be in the same place for a second season. Now, those are 2 groups that I look at and say, boy, you're losing a lot of talent. And even though I like the guys that are coming, I don't know that you can expect. Think about it like this. 2023, Oregon has Jackson Powers Johnson. Wins the Remington Award. Guy is starting for the Raiders, who are a disastrous organization, but he's really good. At least from what I have seen. Poncho this year at center was good. But can you say that he was as good as JPJ? Of course not. Doesn't mean he didn't have a good season. He did. But the center position in 2023 to 2024, there was a drop-off. Because that guy that he's replacing is just that good, and they don't come around very often. And it's hard to have a guy as talented as that with that much experience just waiting in the wings at a variety of positions. So those are 2 groups that I look at and say, I hope they can be as good, but they're probably going to be 80 and 90% of what they were a season ago. And this is just to your question of, are there any that won't be better? Like, those are 2 where I don't think you can be better, and I think you're hoping to be as good. Then I go to the wide receiver spot, where you lose Tez Johnson, Trayshawn Holden. Like, that's just a lot. That's a lot of production. Now, plenty of talent in that room. Bring in Malik Benson. Maybe that's a Trayshawn Holden type where he's playing a lot of Z receiver and is a big body guy on the outside. You bring back Evan Stewart. That's huge. You bring in DeCorian Moore. Can DeCorian as a true freshman be as good as Tez Johnson was in his 4th or 5th year of college football last year? It's asking a lot. I see how you could get there. But that's another position group where when you lose 2 guys, I was always bullish on Trayshawn Holden. He was really good. And we all love and know how good Tez was for the last cut. Did you know he's Bo Nix's brother, by the way? I struggle to see how you're elevating at that spot. And then you go to the quarterback, which I think you hit the nail on the head. Dante Moore has a higher ceiling than Dylan Gabriel. He's bigger and has a bigger arm. But his floor is absolutely lower. Gabriel had an incredibly high floor. That's one of the reasons that Oregon brought him in, is you know what he's going to be, and he was exactly what I expected, and he was great. Doesn't mean he was great in every single moment, and I know Oregon's season didn't end the way it wanted to, and the offense really struggled, but on the whole, Dylan Gabriel is exactly what we expected, or at least what I expected, and what Oregon was looking for. But Dante Moore, there are a lot bigger peaks and valleys where you've got room to grow there. So those are just a couple of the position groups. Now, there are other ones on the flip side where I'd say maybe Trey McNutt is just a bona fide stud. Thieneman goes back to being his 2023 self at Purdue, and you do have better safeties than what Oregon had in 2024. And I thought their safety play was better than 23, but still, as we saw in the Rose Bowl, was not good enough. Was not where Oregon needs it to be. And I look at the corners and say, well, Nico Reed had an awesome season. He was phenomenal. He was also behind Jaleel Florence on the depth chart in 2023 when Florence was healthy. So Florence is coming back, and if he's fully healthy, well, yeah, then you could have a better player than Nico Reed on the outside. Do you have someone that's better than Jabbar Muhammad? I don't know. There are questions there. But overall, Dylan, I think you came at this question with, man, it seems like we're going to get better at all these spots. I think Oregon is going to face an uphill battle and will have to do a lot of high-end coaching and development to even have a roster that performs at its highest level the way that this one did. Now, as we saw throughout the year, whether it's the Rose Bowl, the Idaho, the Boise State game, Wisconsin, wherever, there are peaks and valleys, so there might be days where Oregon looks better next season. But right now, do I expect it? I picked Oregon to go 12-0, and I picked them to win the Big Ten championship game against Penn State. Right now, I would not pick Oregon to go 12-0. Their schedule is pretty favorable, so I still think they're a double-digit win team. I don't know about 12-0, at least right now. Maybe you guys will talk me into that as time goes on, but they're losing a lot. So I didn't even hit every position group there. Those are just the ones that stand out the most to me. Defensive line, offensive line, quarterback, you're facing an uphill battle to just be at the level where you were a season ago, let alone surpass it. And those are three pretty important position groups. That's a good question, though. That's a very good question. And any position group questions you got, by all means, you know how to get in touch with me, or at least you should if you don't by now. So, a question came in about the SEC, which I find interesting because Oregon is competing against the SEC every year for recruits, sometimes on the field, not that often, but eventually Oregon could play an SEC team in a playoff game. Is it still the SEC's world and we're just living in it? Not so much. First reminder, this episode brought to you by Game Time. Attending the new 12-team college football playoff is an incredible experience when your team isn't down 34-0 in the first half, but I imagine you're all glad you went anyway because you get to go and experience it with other people. Even though it wasn't the day we were hoping for at the Rose Bowl, if you want to get tickets to an event like that or any other, then you need to check out Game Time. Game Time has Game Time picks that makes getting tickets for events even easier. It filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. I have used Game Time myself. It is incredibly easy. I am not that technologically savvy, which is hilariously ironic given the field that I work in, but that's the truth, and Game Time makes it easy to get to checkout, find great deals, and get exactly what you want. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE. That's LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, this mailbag question came in from Bud. The sample size is relatively small, but the SEC seems to have taken a step backward in the last few years as having the best teams in the country. Fact check, true. What are your thoughts on how much this has been influenced by NIL and the transfer portal, and how do you feel that Oregon's program in the Big Ten in general will continue to successfully use these new tools? I have full faith and confidence that Oregon will have whatever resource it needs to go compete for a national championship. They just have to put together the right roster. Coaching staff has to continue to get better, and they have to have the right season where things go your way. That's all it is. There is not a need for investment. And again, as a Mariners fan, let me tell you, that's not always the case. Sometimes you don't have an all-in sort of commitment. There are plenty of colleges across the country. Arizona State was like this for a long time, and Dillingham is changing things down there, where there was not the necessary level of administrative and community buy-in and commitment to making the football program great. Arizona State should have been what they were this season a long time ago. They showed a couple glimpses of it, but they never sustained it because they didn't always make the right coaching hires, but they also haven't cared as much as they needed to see the Herm Edwards situation. It was just all an entire debacle. My guy Richie Bradshaw, Locked On Sun Devils, can tell you all about it. But for Oregon going out and trying to win a national championship, it used to feel like they're going to have to go through the SEC, or at some point they're going to have to be playing at an SEC sort of level. The SEC does not have a monopoly on the best talent in college football in the same way it used to. It was never, strictly speaking, a monopoly. You had ACC and Big Ten teams that would win, but Ohio State's going to thump Notre Dame. That'll be 2 straight years the Big Ten wins a national championship. That's a conference Oregon just won, by the way. I'm going to remind you all of that a lot over the course of the offseason, because I know it was a horrible ending to what was a really great year, but in the aftermath, it felt like Oregon was a lot further away from the national championship than they actually were. There is a strong likelihood, nothing's ever guaranteed, but there is a strong likelihood Oregon is going to have a victory over the eventual national champion. So, that didn't used to feel that way. When you beat a team, when Oregon would beat a team like Ohio State in 2021, it felt more like, well, they just pulled a huge upset and that's great, but Ohio State's not really a national title contender. They're really good. It's a huge win, but they're not as good as, the SEC team. And Georgia went out and dominated. And then in 2022, Oregon learned, long ways away from where the SEC is at. The reign of the SEC dominating college football, that's over. They're still really good. There are a bunch of great teams. I'd probably even sit here and say they're the best conference. But playing a team from the SEC is not as daunting as it used to be. They are far more beatable. And yes, to your point, bud, NIL and the portal have a huge role in all of that. I do not believe it's a coincidence that as NIL and the portal have taken off, Nick Saban retired. Now, a huge part of that, I believe, is the frustration. Somebody told me one time that they were looking at either a high school or a transfer portal prospect at Alabama, and the kid went into Nick Saban's office and started making some demands, and Saban said, "Buddy, there's the door over there." I think the older coaches got tired of that. Not Dana Altman, who I'll touch on in a moment, but I definitely see the landscape in college football shifting towards, hey, it's more gettable now for teams outside the SEC than it used to be. And I think that's more about the SEC not being able to build as dominant of a team as they used to be able to than it is everyone else has risen up to that level. SEC teams are still really good. There are a bunch of great players. They'll have the most draft picks and they recruit really well. They still do all of that. However, the benefit of the doubt that should be given to that conference is no different than what should be given to the Big Ten. I think those two leagues are clearly above the ACC and the Big 12. But we're now going to be in 2 straight years with a Big Ten national champion. It's a small sample size, sure. But the evidence on the field, I haven't seen anything except the SEC playing more average football. Alabama lost to Vanderbilt, for goodness sake. The talent is just spreading out. And I saw this going around one time on Twitter, and I thought it was funny, but then it is funny. But then I thought about it more, and it does kind of make sense that once everyone was allowed to pay players, the SEC wasn't as dominant. And by the way, I do not fault the SEC for paying players before it was quote-unquote legal. At all. It was always a ridiculous notion. I remember this story about a few years ago, several years ago at this point, that Zion Williamson got money to go to Duke. Oh my gosh, can you believe? Zion Williamson got money. I'm like, of course he did. Are you kidding me? Stop pretending. Stop pretending like it's this clean, perfect world that you have in your head. No, it's not. It's not. So the SEC is still going to put out national title contenders every single year. But the best team in the SEC for the last couple of seasons has not felt like the best team in the SEC did in prior years. So we'll continue to evolve that particular opinion here on the show if data points change, but we've got 2 seasons of this now. Once can be a coincidence, twice might be a trend a little bit. So continuing to monitor here. As I continue to monitor Oregon basketball, they just win. That's the best thing you can say about Dana Altman's team right now. They have notched 7 quad 1 victories after a couple of, you guessed it, late comebacks against Ohio State and Penn State on the road. They're tied with Auburn, who everybody views as a national title contender because they are. They're really good. Oregon and Auburn are tied at the top of college basketball for the most quad 1 wins in the country. This is the best start at 15-2 Dana Altman has had since the 2016-17 season. And I know the thought of any sort of postseason play makes Oregon fans shudder right now. I get it. But the depth on this team cannot be overstated. It looks different every game. Sometimes they win with defense. Sometimes they win with 3-point shooting. Sometimes they win with offense. It does always come down to Jackson Shelstad being awesome. He had a go-ahead bucket with 47 seconds to go. Bam Tracy hit some big free throws, and Oregon beat Penn State by 1 point on the road. It was a hectic finish. There was a discussion on the broadcast, by the way, about whether Bam Tracy was allowed to run the baseline, and Connor Onion and his partner said very declaratively that he should have been called for a travel and that he wasn't allowed to run. That is not my understanding, and I asked a couple of different people that work in college athletics and know that sort of thing about that, and I don't believe that they were correct. So if you were watching and heard that, I have not been able to talk to a referee. Next time I call an SEU game, I'm going to just to see what he says. I don't know that was right, but regardless, Oregon just keeps finding ways to win, and that's a great thing to say about a college basketball team. In football, you feel like, it's going to catch up to you eventually. In basketball, you just got to win. You want the easiest path through March Madness, you go get one of the top seeds. And guess what? It doesn't matter how these games look. You just have to win them. So Oregon beat Ohio State and Penn State on the road. They trailed in the second half. Again, Shelstad hit big shots. Again, Nate Biddle is really good. Shelstad is finding his 3-point shot. I knew that streak was going to come about eventually. And lo and behold, when Shelstad's hitting threes, this offense is awesome. Depth, talent, versatility, it's all there. I love this squad. Everydayers know I have hyped them up since they added TJ Baum, but really even before that, but after as well. I love where this team is at right now. And they play Purdue at home on Saturday. If you're in Eugene, get to that game. That's a huge, huge matchup. Appreciate everyone listening. See you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.